A History of Southern Missouri and Northern Arkansas by William Monks, published in 1907. Loyal Women Driven from Their Homes, Part 2. They would at once commence inquiring for their husbands and sons. Numbers of them never found them, as they had been captured, killed, and imprisoned while attempting to reach the Federal lines. Oh, the untold misery that then confronted them. After they had traveled and half-starved and suffered from cold and exposure, promising themselves that when they reached the Federal lines they would again meet their loved ones who could again care for them, they were doomed to disappointment in a large number of instances. Those who did meet their husbands and sons were also disappointed. They had either joined the service or been employed by the government as guides and scouts, and the small amount of pay they received from the government wouldn't provide food and raiment for their families. They were compelled to still be absent from their families, although they were suffering greatly for all of the necessaries of life and for clothing and shelter. The women's task of caring for and looking after the family and the little ones was just as great after they had reached the Federal lines as before. The government ordered that wherever aid could be given, rations should be issued to the families, and while the government did all it could in this way, it was not able to furnish shelter and houses for their comfort. Winter came on, and they underwent untold suffering. Disease set in from exposure, besides the contagious diseases of smallpox and measles, and hundreds of them died for want of proper attention, while their men were in the lines of the service of the government. Here let the author speak a word in behalf of the devotion and patriotism manifested by those loyal women who had given their husbands and their sons to be placed upon the altar of the country, and sacrificed their homes and their firesides, had become exiles and wanderers, without home or shelter, had undergone untold suffering, had faced disease and death, had seen the little ones die calling for Papa, shivering with cold, suffering with hunger, all for the love of their country. Yet when they would see the Federal troops move by, with the stars and stripes unfurled, they would cheer the boys in blue as they would pass, and urge them to save the country they loved so well, and had made so many sacrifices for, and were still willing to suffer and wrestle with all the ills that a desperate war had brought upon the country, and wanted to live to once more be returned to their own hearthstones, and be permitted to live under their own vine and fig tree, where no man dare molest them or make them afraid, to again enjoy all the sweet comforts of life. We revere and honor every Federal soldier who enlisted in the interest of his country from the northern states, where they knew nothing about war except what they read, the families being left in comfortable circumstances with plenty to eat and wear, and friends to speak words of comfort to them, while their husbands and sons had gone to the front and were willing to sacrifice themselves on the altar of their country if it became necessary. But oh, the comparison between the sacrifices made by the loyal element in those portions of the country where they were completely surrounded by the enemy. Those who were willing to lay upon the altar of their country their fathers and sons, their wives and children, their property and their sacred honor, in support of the government they loved so well, with no protection from the government, no arms, ammunition, rations, clothing, or pay from the government was thought of for a moment. The only question that prompted, ruled, and controlled them was their patriotism to their God and their country. When we come to compare the sacrifices, privations, suffering, and services between the two classes of loyalists, the first referred to sink into insignificance. Oh, never let us forget to honor and revere patriotism and sacrifices that were made by the loyal men and women that were surrounded in the enemy's country and continued fighting without and within. Their husbands and sons were shot and hung and imprisoned all over this country, whose bodies never were even honored with a burial. Orders being made by the rebels that they should not be buried, but yet they live and speak in thunder tones to the living. Let us plead with the living to revere and honor the stars and stripes that were maintained and supported by the blood and lives and sacrifices of the loyal men and women of the South. After the rebels had completely driven all the loyal elements out of the country, and had but one political party left, they exclaimed, "Now the means that we have been forced to use are very harsh, but the line has been drawn, and all of the parties who are giving aid and comfort to the lop-eared Dutch are outside of the Confederate line, and we will never be troubled with them and the lop-eared Dutch any more." The author went back in retreat with General Sigel after the Wilson Creek battle. On reaching Rolla, Missouri, Sigel went into quarters for the winter. The author was almost worn out with exposure and traveling, and as General Sigel informed him that there would be no advance made south until the spring of 1862, and as his family had been left in comfortable circumstances with plenty to eat and wear, and he being acquainted with some men by the name of Cope who lived near Jerseyville in Jersey County, Illinois, went to that place, remained a month, and being taken sick with lung fever, came very near dying. He told his friends where he was staying that if he died, he would die dissatisfied, that he wanted to live and be able to move with the Federal command in the spring of 1862 when it moved south. After he had partially recovered, he learned that a Mr. Cope, who was living neighbor to him at the time of his arrest and capture, had moved into Randolph County, Illinois. He visited the family at once, hoping to hear from his family at home, and remained there about a month. His wife, among many others, being notified to leave, had been informed that the author had made his escape, reached Springfield, and had gone back with Sigel in his retreat to Rolla. She was permitted to dispose of just enough of the property at the rebels' own prices to enable her to move, the family consisting of herself and 5 small children. She was followed on the road, and her wagon searched for arms, and the rebels threatened to take her to Little Rock, Arkansas. But to enable her to reach Rolla, Missouri, she posed as the wife of a rebel who had gone into the Confederate service, and said she was trying to reach her father, who resided near Rolla. By making that impression, her wagons were not disturbed any more. On reaching Rolla, she went to Colonel Phelps, who was afterwards governor of the state, and he inquired if he knew anything of the whereabouts of the author. He informed her that he had no knowledge of his whereabouts at that time, but he would take her name, place an advertisement of her arrival at Rolla in the paper, and if he was alive it might reach him. Every house and cabin was full, it being in the dead of winter, and a deep snow upon the ground, but through the aid and assistance of one Cyrus Newberry, who had escaped through the lines in Howell County, she procured a shelter about 3 miles north of Rolla, which was very uncomfortable. Her clothes were partially frozen on her at that time. In a short time, the advertisement reached the author in Randolph County, Illinois. He at once set out for Rolla, Missouri, to meet his family. The house that she had first got into was used by her but a short time, and she had been forced to go into one of the huts that had lately been occupied by the soldiers and had been made vacant by their moving west to Springfield. On the arrival of the author, the horror and the joy that were intermingled. I was proud to once more meet my wife and children, but in a moment the thought would pass through my mind, I left you in a comfortable home with plenty to eat, and now to see you here in this dugout, suffering for food and shelter. Oh, the war, the horrible war! What is it that men won't do?" I set out at once to procure a comfortable shelter for my family and to get in readiness to move south with the army. General Curtis, then in command of the Western Department, was preparing to make a general move south. I was employed by the government as a guide, receiving $1.50 per day with rations and clothing.